So, on last night's episode of The Real Housewives of Potomac, part two of the reunion dedicated about 3 to 4 minutes to the topic of colorism. And, I asked this question on my social media. I asked last night, what did you guys think of the conversation? What did you want from it? What did you think of the ladies' response of it? What do you think about the viewer response from it? And I woke up this morning. I literally haven't even eaten my breakfast. And I said, we need to have a separate ponderosa about this topic because I feel as though this also should have had a separate space within the context of the reunion for this level of conversation. So, the first thing that I want to bring your attention to is something that I happened to catch last night on our friends over at Reality Chats on Instagram. So, one of the things that Candiace had tweeted was she said, a commitment to misunderstanding me in the colorism conversation from the fairest of them all does nothing but fuel the fire. My example was clearly communicated. Now, I want to stop right there because here we have I think that everybody can reasonably assume that Candiace is calling out Giselle in this regard. So I think this sort of touches on something that I feel like could have been done a lot better with this conversation. And I do want to start by saying that I think that this was a good start, but I overall don't know if it was as productive as it could have been. And I think I want to use this as an example. I think that personally, I get why the ladies may have wanted to have a separate conversation amongst themselves, but I do think it should have been separate. Meaning, first, I do feel like this should have been like about a 30 minutes or an hour long special, an hour long, to be honest with you. But I also understand that I don't know if the network is willing to offer that extra incentive to have a 4-part reunion and dedicate the full hour to this topic, because what we know is that typically the ladies are paid on a per episode basis. So adding another episode would mean also likely that you would have to pay them for a separate episode, right? So there's the first issue I think that we have to address. Let's go ahead and dedicate a separate issue to this and pay these ladies for that separate episode. All right, let's do that. Um, in the same way that we're getting a 30-minute special with Robin, because typically I don't believe the ladies are paid for Watch What Happens Live. So, in doing Watch What Happens Live and doing a one on one sit down, I don't believe that there's any extra pay that is involved for her for that sit down. So I think that that is the first issue. You need to have a separate conversation, a 30 to 40-minute special. I say 40-minute because you do an hour-long show and it's typically about 42 minutes of television when you include the commercials, right? So that's issue number one. Issue number two that really hits on what Candiace is saying about Giselle's alleged commitment to misunderstanding her, I think would have benefited from also having a moderator moderate this conversation. Someone who is not only clued in, tapped in, and turned on to the issues within Potomac specifically, someone who has watched the show over the years, understands the ladies' complex histories, I should say, and um, also someone who understands the nuance of colorism as it relates to not only Black women, but also women of all color, hues, and nationalities. Because I think that something Candace states later on, and I'm going to show it to you, really resonates and hits that point because I think in order for the audiences that don't understand colorism, you need to understand that it is deeply rooted within our society and where it comes from and how it hits on not only black women but a lot of different cultures, right? But I also feel like a moderator would have done a very good job at holding the ladies accountable for maybe not under choosing not to understand something because you don't like somebody, right? And that needs to be touched on because it seemed as though that Giselle may have been misunderstanding Candice because she doesn't like her. Because we know that Robin and Giselle will base their positioning based on whether or not they like a person. Okay. We've come to realize that within the context of the reunion itself, they don't have the same standards when it comes to their convictions because they don't like Wendy, right? Who happens to be a darker skinned woman, right? So there's a nuance and a complexity to that that I feel like a neutral third party would be able to really break down to the two of them to really understand how that is impactful, not only to the franchise, but also to the viewers, right? And then I think we need to touch on the fact that, at the start of the conversation, Candace starts the discussion with the idea that she doesn't feel like anyone on the cast is colorist. But I also think that I don't know that it should have been the onus of Candace or Wendy or Karen to completely have the burden of explaining, okay, um, the examples of colorism to some women who may again be committed to misunderstanding them because they don't like them, right? And again, a neutral party would have been able to objectively state, hey, you're y- is this because you don't like her that you're not understanding her? Like, what is that? Also, again, why is it up to members of the cast to educate these women on what they could be doing? And the other thing about that is, I also feel like I think what Candace, and maybe I don't know if Wendy pointed this out as well, but Candace pointed out that it is not always the cast that is exhibiting these um that is always making this even more difficult. I also think that it would have benefited from having a live audience there to ask questions. And I know I'm asking for a lot, but because you have a live audience for Watch What Happens Live, I know that these things can happen. And I know that it would have probably been difficult to keep that under wraps, but I do think that there is some merit because I think that it is also an understanding that perhaps the audience and we as viewers need, when it comes to the idea of colorism. So I think that there is so many layers here and so many missed opportunities from last night. Again, I think it's a good start, but I also would have likely removed Andy from the stage because I also think that you're forced to have a conversation in front of your boss. And we all know that typically conversations in front of our boss tend to be a lot more politically correct than what we would have at the kitchen table, you know um so the and if these elements had been improved on, and these are my notes, I don't know if anybody who is from the show actually watches what I'm saying, but these would be my notes for an improvement should this conversation ever come up again. And I think that to be truly progressive, I would go ahead and schedule these types of roundtable discussions so that the audience who is not aware of what colorism is understands how it impacts communities. Okay. The other thing that Candiace stated in this was that she truly appreciates everyone for their constructive and thoughtful contributions. The conversation on colorism, to the conversation on colorism. Wish we could have shown more and spoken longer. And that hits at what I was saying about a much longer discussion and perhaps paying them for a longer episode. And so another user states, quite annoying to watch that lady have a nasty tone questioning you in an effort to shoot down your feelings instead of trying to gain understanding. And Candice responds and says, a nasty tone indeed. The energy in the room coming from that direction was that of irritation and discomfort. I wish I could share everything. It was very telling. And I too wish that I could have seen more of what that discussion looked like, because clearly it went on for longer than we saw, which again also hits at what I was saying about us being able to watch a longer televised conversation. But the other part of what I was saying earlier, I think, goes to something that Candace mentioned on the Twitter. A Twitter user responded and says, it's in my Asian Indian community as well. There is a stark difference between the level of grace I receive in comparison to my lighter skinned friends. The indelible stain of colonialism runs through and through. And then Candace responds and says, thank you for saying this. This is why an extended conversation on colorism is important, because it is a global epidemic that transcends just the Black community. It plagues so many communities of color. And again, another reason why I feel like it would have been nice to have a someone who is an expert on this topic facilitate this conversation, because I feel like there are so many points that need to be touched on that really, I think, make this issue, that could really explain this issue in the way that it needs to be explained. Because I think when you're talking about it in the confines of this show, you also miss the mark on potentially hitting at where it resides on other shows. Potentially. Okay. So that those are my thoughts on this. And the reason why I did not want to have this discussion solely within the confines of my own review on the show was because I felt like, similar to how I feel about them having that conversation within the confines of a tightly paced reunion episode, does no justice for it. I felt like I needed to touch on these topics without feeling rushed, without feeling like I needed to um uh dive past this for fear of going so far over time limit that I don't have the proper time and attention to give this topic. You know what I'm saying? So I hope that I conveyed myself in a way that was clear and as concise as possible. I am definitely choosing to use my words as carefully as I can, because I know that this is a very serious topic and it is one that plagues many communities. So, having said that, I would like to know what your thoughts are. Do you feel like it was enough? Do you feel like there were areas of improvement for this conversation? And what would you have done differently? I would like to get your feedback in the comment section down below. And with that being said, I will talk to you in the next video that you will see, which will be a live discussion of the recap of the Real Housewives of Potomac Season 7 Reunion Part 2. With that being said, I will see you then.